right now. I will introduce things and our speakers. My name is Zoran Samardzija, as you can see. Along with Ervin, we've been working on this CES. This is not one of the CSI spinoffs. A CES European Cinema Network. The idea always really is to create a virtual space for scholars working on the regions and the areas. This is our, I believe, our fifth kind of roundtable or panel. If you look in the chat, you'll see the link to the website. And if you have any interest in presenting, anything recently published, anything you're working on, send us an email. Though we're kind of the organizers, we want to think of this more of as a collective, right? We're very open to ideas and suggestions. So please do reach out. Probably nothing over the summer, but if you have any ideas for the fall or anything like that, that would be great. But yes, you can follow us on Twitter. You'll get a link to the YouTube channel if you want to look at previous talks as well. Been a couple of good ones, so please do that. So you have the website, but let me just sort of introduce today's panel and our first speaker. So this is new work on CES European cinemas, Victimhood in Croatian cinema and Holocaust and Genocide. I'm sorry, I'm reading this wrong. Holocaust and Genocide in Croatian cinema. We have three great speakers. I'm going to introduce them individually in the order of speaking, generally about 20 minutes each. We'll have questions at the end. So as you are thinking about what you may want to ask a speaker, by all means, put it in the chat and we can get to that once everyone speaks. Of course, you're always welcome to just hold your question and kind of raise your hand virtually, small enough groups so where we can kind of all converse together. But if you do have a question, you want to remember for a speaker individually, please, you're welcome to type it in there. We'll just get to them all at the end. Okay, so our first speaker, let me introduce Tamara. Tamara Kolarić is a political science and memory scholar working on the intersection between politics, memory, and film, with a particular interest in the post-Yugoslav region. She holds a PhD in political science for Central European University and is currently assistant professor with School of Applied Language and Intercultural Studies at Dublin City University. Prior to this, she was a global teaching fellow with Bard College Berlin. Welcome. I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, okay, so this is a little bit new for me. Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. Give me a moment to share my screen to make sure that everyone sees at least a little bit of these films that I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to try to make my presentation a little bit shorter than 20 minutes so that we have a little bit of time for discussion, but I'm also not sure if I will succeed because everyone always promises that they would. So this is a very awkwardly titled paper, actually a chapter that I submitted last year and that I don't actually know the face of yet and what's going to happen with it. It's a little bit of a passion project or a side project of mine that evolved out of me doing my PhD research a couple of years back. And I titled it The Evolution of Victimhood, Self-Victimization in Two Recent Croatian Films, because what I was kind of interested in doing is asking myself, okay, so have we moved on in Croatian film in talking about a particular set of events, and those are the events of the 90s. But I'll get to that in a second, because I wanted to give you a couple of introductory notes on what this presentation was inspired by and what kind of moved and motivated this mini project, but also a little bit of self-reflection on this project. So when I started my PhD, I did not know that I will end up working in cinema. And then I realized once I kind of got introduced to the whole memory studies literature, which was also very new to me, and kind of accidentally I stumbled into it, there's very little research at that point in cinema and the impact that cinema has on memory in post-Yugoslav countries. That has in the meantime changed, but at that point I felt that there is this really a lack of people asking questions of what is the relevance of cinema in national political memory, both in Croatia and the rest of the region, when it came to the events in the 1990s, the breakup of Yugoslavia and the creation of a number of new nation states. And so I was quite curious about this, and I dedicated in the end a whole PhD thesis to this and to exploring the kinds of narratives that films tell about the breakup of Yugoslavia, in particular in the case of Croatia. What is it that films do to the collective memory and the official, what Alida Asman calls the political memory, this official memory narrative of how the so-called homeland war, I always use it with quotation marks, but quotation marks are awkward on Zoom. What kind of stories do films add to the homeland war memory? And part of doing that PhD project was looking at, okay, so what had happened after the 90s? What kinds of narratives have films offered? Did they serve as corrective to the dominant narrative, or did they just amplify the dominant narrative? But one thing that I was kind of intrigued by was, well, have we in those narratives also evolved from the particular kinds of storytelling that we had in the 90s? My apologies for the noise in the back, that's my cats making a mess. And so this particular paper grew out of a little bit of frustration after seeing two films in the course of 5 years, seemingly taking us back to the stories of the 90s. And that's what I'm going to talk about mostly. I also want to clarify the scope of this project, or specifically what I actually mean when I talk about these films. So there's a lot of interest in analyzing film texts when it comes to memory in the former Yugoslavia, but sometimes I feel like we maybe take these films a little bit too seriously as memory objects, because we assume that just because a film talks about the past, it also contributes to the memory of its fairly recent past. And I really like this distinction that Astrid Erl makes in her 2011 book between films as memory productive, so films that talk about the past, which can be recent or very distant, but also films as memory objects that are not necessarily the same as memory productive films. So just because something offers a narrative of the past doesn't necessarily mean that it contributes to national memory. And part of the interest in this project, and actually part of my future interest, is about what don't we know about how much films contribute to memory in the former Yugoslavia, and specifically in Croatia. And I will try to tell you why, while I treat these films as memory productive, but not necessarily memory films, why I think that they are good candidates to be memory films. I call them memory offerings, so films that have the potential to create memory. I think these two films are in a bit of a specific position. But I also want to make a little bit of a footnote on this whole paper, and something that I think might be a little bit problematic about it. And I will very gladly accept ideas on how to resolve this. So I'm, as I already mentioned, a very boring political scientist. And political scientists very often talk about the problem of concept stretching. So if we have a concept that is supposed to describe a complex human community or action, say democracy, how far can we stretch that concept in order to encompass as many cases as possible? When does something stop being a democracy? And on paper, that's usually pretty easy to see. Well, you need free and fair elections. But in practice, when do the elections tip over free and fair? When are we supposed to add an adjective to Hungary and say, well, it's still a democracy, but? Or are there trade-offs with this? And I feel this entire endeavor that I'm about to present is a little bit of a concept stretching. And I'll tell you why. And I'm a little bit torn on how productive that actually is. But I wanted to kind of put that out before I tell you what I'm actually doing. Changing the slide. So just to be clear, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about political memory narrative of the 90s, or the story of the Homeland War, this is a very, very rough breakdown of what I think is the official memory narrative of the Homeland War. So the story that the Croatian official institutions, but also a large parts of society broadly, tell about what had happened in the 90s. And it has roughly, I would say, and I don't think this is particularly original, a three-part structure. So this idea of the initial situation in which Croatia was coming at the crossroads of realizing independence, breaking off from Yugoslavia, which was then interrupted by an overpowering aggressor. In this case, a combination of Serbian paramilitaries, Yugoslav army, and later also Serbian army, attacking the whole of the Croatian nation. So this one entity, which takes on, and this is going to be particularly important for today, the role of the victim, but through heroism against all odds, considering a stronger enemy, the nation as a whole, very often represented to a particular special individual, defeats the aggressors, resurfaces, and this is done in a purely defensive, heroic, and just manner. So you will probably know that I bolded this part of takes on the role of the victim. And so in the national narrative of what had happened in Croatia gaining independence in the 90s, a key part is this part of victimization. We are being attacked, and we are being attacked by a much stronger aggressor. Why this narrative in the first place? Well, because in the 90s, for those of you who are familiar with the Yugoslav breakup history, this was seen as politically useful, a way to attract the attention of international community, to position Croatia in a particular relationship to what was seen as the aggressor. Now, what I really want to stress, and what is very important for me, is that this is in no way an attempt to say, well, this is some kind of specificity of these Balkan countries that were, fighting their own small wars. In fact, as can be seen in this quote by L.A. Dasman, this kind of self-victimization and the emphasis on national victimhood in national identity narratives, national memory narratives is quite common, and it is in no way typical only of this part of the world, which is very, very important for me to stress. So what did I want to do? This is a little bit a strange formulation for a research question, not exactly a research question, but what I was wondering was, did Croatian cinema let go of this idea of nation as the victim, which was very prevalent in the 90s? I'll talk about this in a second. And if it did or it didn't, can I capture this with a conceptual apparatus that already exists? Can I use a framework that already exists and helps me answer this question rather than to create one from scratch? And what I did in the process of answering this very vaguely formulated question was that I essentially analyzed the text of two feature-length fiction films that explicitly thematize the war, which I think are kind of biasly selected based on the fact that I think they reproduce this particular narrative. Now, what does it mean, self-victimization in Croatian cinema? So in order to answer this question, I turn back to this wonderful book, some of you might be familiar with, by Jurica Pavičić, who was, to my knowledge at least, the first person who kind of conceptualized this idea of what self-victimization would mean in film. So in 2011, Pavičić, who is a film scholar, not a memory scholar, asked the question, has there been something specific in the relationship between politics and film in the region that helped create a particular type or style of films? Has politics impacted the style of films that were produced in the former Yugoslavia in then the past 20 years? And he says, well, there were three stylistic models that were created out of the particular intersection. Those three stylistic models are cinema of self-victimization, of self-balkanization, and of normalization. These are by no means the only stylistic models that were present in the films, in the countries of in the former Yugoslav countries following the 90s conflict, but they were the dominant models. What I'm interested in is this last model, and it is started by this film that you can see the poster for on the left of the slide, called Vrijeme za, Time 2, by Oja Kodar. And Pavičić analyzes this and a number of other films to show that the films of self-victimization, which offered this national narrative of self-victimization on film, had four main characteristics. One was that they showed a black and white characterization of the warring sides, usually the good Croats and the bad, often diabolically evil Serbs. And this tended to include a particular set of visual tropes. Serbs are bearded with traditional Chetnik imagery. They are usually overweight, very ugly, drinking. So a particular set of visual cues. They also used a lot of explanatory discourse. So in these films, they were constantly explaining what's going on in the war. Why? Who is attacking? Who is the guilty party? What is going on here? There was this minor element which he calls specialization in the rural Arcadia. So this notion of the nation as this rural area usually Slavonia, but also sometimes these almost biblical landscapes in Croatia. And finally, 2 8-piece elements, which is a particular dramaturgy for these films. And he says, usually they rely on repetitive motifs and a particular dramatic structure, which has 7 elements. Starts with the self-deceptiveness. Somebody is lying about being in the case of film of Oyakodar, for example, somebody is lying about being friends with their Croatian neighbors, but actually wanting to achieve a greater Serbia. Croats are naive about this. Some wise Croats warn them of the deceptiveness, but there's a denial of reality on most of the characters. This is followed by a military attack, an exodus, so some kind of refugee experience, and finally a climax in some form of religious ceremony. And the end characteristic is that in these films, the Croatian characters are always passive sufferers. So they're not actually the active doers, even when they're defending themselves, even when they're soldiers. They're passive sufferers to whom things happen. So these were the films of the 90s, and Pavić says they were very useful at the time, because as I already mentioned, there was an incentive to create a particular narrative of what was going on. And this narrative was funded by public money because of how the films were funded at that point in time. But Pavić says this particular stylistic model ends in 1990 with the last film of the model, which is Bogorodica, which is also the kind of purest film of the model. But it seems to me that that's not true. And that's what I want to kind of show you today in this presentation. I want to show it by analyzing 2 films that at first might not at all seem like they represent the model. The first one of them is this one, number 55, or Broj 55 by Kristijan Milić, a film from 2014, which is actually an action film. Now, if anything doesn't sound like a passive representation of suffering, it is an action film. This is a film that was produced for the Croatian public service broadcaster as the first in a row of 6 films that were supposed to be made about key battles in the Homeland War. I put the budget on this slide because it was very high for Croatian standards, but not out of the ordinary. And it also got assistance from the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior. So formal approval by governing structures in a sense. This was not a particularly successful film. It had about 15,000 cinema goers. Now, the reason why that matters and why I say cinema goers is that we actually don't know how many people ended up seeing this film. Because in Croatia, not only are the ticket sales data fairly unreliable, but this is also a film that's available on various online platforms and even on the online platform of the HRT, so the Croatian public broadcaster. So it's very hard to tell how many people were reached by this film. It got a very favorable critical reception. And what's particularly relevant is that this was described as a film that is not the repetition of the patriotic self-victimization stories from the 1990s, but a huge departure from this, except for a very few film critics, including Damir Radić, who noted the opposite, that this is actually a film that repeats the matrix of the Croatian, classical Croatian ideological narrative. The second film is a little bit more obvious, probably for my goal. It is The General, which came out in 2019, which is a fictionalized biography of Ante Gotovina, probably the most well-known Croatian army general, played by Goran Višnjić, a form of international star. This was a film with an even higher budget. And this was also a film that received a lot of logistical aid and military equipment from the Ministry of Defense, so official support. This was also the highest grossing Croatian film in 2019, so it was also seen by a wide number of audience. If this number doesn't look particularly impressive, this is because Croatian filmgoers usually don't watch a lot of Croatian films, but it is actually quite a bit of success for a Croatian film. It was also a television series which was screened on national television, but it got pretty poor critical reception. So it was pretty much criticized for all segments. Now, what makes these 2 films relevant for me and why I think they are closer to memory films than most films is because they are made as middle-brow films, so films that tell an important story with a decent budget, which also get official support and backing, not just by state institutions, but also by viewers. For example, for General, the then president, Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, visited the premiere of the film and said that she's very happy that foreign audiences as well now get the chance to see the truth about what was actually happening. So this is one measure of relevance for these films. Now, do these films fill in the requirements that Pavić sets earlier 4 films of self-victimization. Do they actually reproduce the same narrative? If you remember, there are 4 elements of the narrative, and I will try to kind of quickly, because I'm sensing I'm running out of time, take you through these elements. The first element is the black and white characterization. Both of these films, in fact, use very familiar visual tropes of Serbs as bearded, overweight, drunken, etc. Particularly interesting is number 55, which draws inspiration from action cinema. So it turns Serbian soldiers, soldiers in a version of Assault on Precinct 13 zombies swarming on the Croatian soldiers as they're coming in throughout the movie. Enemy is also highly sexualized. There's a scene in The General in which the Serbian characters are initiating sex while one of the key battles of the Homeland War, Oluja, is being fought, but they're also infantilized. So they're very often seen as congratulating the general for capturing them, General Gotovina. In contrast to this, Croatian soldiers are good, useful, handsome, very often mediated through what we know is familiar war imagery, primarily the Vietnam War, but also constituting what Jana Senkovic calls in her 2002 book, the trope of the good Croatian soldier. They're all, no matter individual characteristics, they're all the good Croatian soldiers. You can see on the right side of this slide an image of, this is actually from the set, an image of the Serbian soldier. Just as for comparison, these are the Croatian soldiers in number 55. On the left is Tomo, who's profiled as the main character, this very nice looking young man. Also notice the rosary around his neck that we'll come to in a second. Is there rural Arcadia in both of these films? Yes, but much more represented in The General. The General also has a more conservative vision of the characters of the Croatian soldiers, and it very often draws on these familiar ideas about what constitutes Croatia. Grandmother's cooking, beautiful landscapes that are constantly repeated. A little bit less in number 55, but also quite present in particular in the way that the characters speak to each other with very different dialects, which try to capture the diversity of Croatians, who are also all just one good, mostly young, mostly fairly handsome soldier. Explanatory discourse. Both of these films, in fact, even though they find themselves in a very different context, so no longer constituting the narrative of the Homeland War, but just repeating it 20-something years after, continuously offer explanations. The General is a particularly clear example of this. Explanations are throughout. This is just one example in a scene where young soldiers are being recruited. They're all in Zagreb coming to be recruited for military, and one of them says, "Today we are all from Croatia since forever and for eternity." The one thing that is not being explained is actually the central question with regard to General Gotovina, and that is his involvement in war crimes and the trial of the ICTY, with which the film ends, which is the one thing that is not being explained at all. In number 55, the explanatory cues are more subtle. There's much more friendly banter between the soldiers in which they're telling each other primarily about the difference in power between the Croatian and the Serb or JNA side at this point. So this is late 1991, mostly epitomized by this phrase, "We are all rookies." You can see on the bottom of the screen this improvised vehicle that is in the film, which is very often the trigger for these kinds of discussions, showing how one side is much stronger than the other. And this is the constant explanation. We don't have enough guns. The other side is much stronger. The dramaturgical elements, are they all there? Yes, but, and this is why I talked about concept stretching in the beginning. So all the elements that Pavicic recognizes as relevant are present in number 55, but they are ordered a little bit differently and sometimes modified to an extent. Croatian naivety, for example, which in the old cohort of films referred to Croats not believing that there will be war, in this case constitutes Croats not believing that the Serb side or the JNA combined Serb forces are going to maliciously stage a surprise ambush for them. There's warnings as well. There's the military attack, which in this case is a situation in which they are being ambushed in the house. There's even deceptiveness in the imagery of an old Serbian woman who is actually hiding a gun. There's an exodus stand-in because the whole film takes place in one house. There is no refugees as such, but there's a character of the Croatian soldier who is wounded in the beginning and who until the end of the film is passively dying, suffering. So he's a stand-in for the exodus. And while there's no religious ritual, because the film only takes place within 24 hours, there are consistent religious symbols. If you remember the rosary that I mentioned from the previous slide. Very similar story in general, a little bit less pronounced. I will leave that for now because I'm running out of time, but you can ask me about that later. But finally, possibly the most important thing, can action from characters be passive sufferers? And this is maybe the most contested part of my analysis, but I argue yes. And that is immediately obvious with how both films start. So Jure Typology, when he writes his wonderful book, notes that one of the biggest changes in Croatian film, from self-victimization to normalization, is a change in dramatic structure. Films start at the end, so to speak. We first see the ending scene, and we see the ending scene because then we go back and it is revealed to us what the ending scene previously hid. But in both of these films, they start from the end in order to establish their heroes as victims. In the case of General Gotovina, we start at the ICP trial, and we are immediately shown this man who we are then taken through the whole film being established as an exquisitely moral character, which also prevents him from doing any active fighting. He's constantly seen stopping the battle, saying, we don't kill soldiers, respect the enemy soldiers. At the end, we see him in front of the ICTY, nothing is explained, but he is presented to us as the victim of the International Court, who was throughout an extremely moral character. So he didn't get to do anything. He's just constantly stopping people from doing things. But he's also victim in a way in front of the audience because he can't have any engagement with the war except for strategizing, because he cannot be shown to act, to kill, to do anything that a soldier would do in the battle. In number 55, the same thing happens. The film starts from the end, and we see at the end that all these soldiers are actually going to be brutally murdered. So we enter the film knowing that they're all really victims. And we know this story because the story is quite familiar to Croatian viewers. So we know that they're actually going to die as martyrs. So no matter how much we watch them shoot, and they shoot at zombies, remember going back to how the Serbian characters are established, we know that it's all in vain. So they are really just going to be sacrificed. And this is all underlined with the character of Kruno that I already mentioned. If we go back to the film poster, this is actually Kruno at the very end, who comes out, he's wounded in the first 30 minutes of the film. He spends an hour of the film crying, whining, moaning. And then by the end, he comes out in front of the shooting squad of these zombie JNA/Serb rebel soldiers just to be shot at over and over and over again. So no agency, just suffering. They're also presented as martyrs in another way, because we learn in the film that what they did through being ambushed in this house is that they've dragged all the enemy soldiers to this location, thus saving Croatian soldiers at other locations. So can we analyze these films as the continuation of Croatian victimhood narrative? I think we can, but we need to rethink what actually constitutes the essence, the concept that Pavičić deals with, and why that actually matters. Because if we allow that the point of the concept is to capture a particular kind of representation and not just a particular dramatic order of the film, then we come to the same conclusion that not much has changed since the 90s, a little bit depressingly. But whether that is concept stretching or not, I leave to my audience to judge. I thank you very much for your time, and my apologies for I think running a little bit over time.
All right, let's give Tamara a virtual applause. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to type them, but we'll get to everything at the end. So let me introduce the next speaker, Ana Kršinić, Lozica. I said that wrong again, sorry. Is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Zagreb University. In her thesis, she deals with transformations of memory on the Jasenovac camp, traced through its representations in visual arts, film, literature, and architecture from 1945 until today. Her earlier work includes a research assistant position at the Croatian Museum of Architecture in collaboration with several curatorial collectives. She recently published a monograph, Beyond Visible, the public sculpture of Vera, I'm going to say that wrong again, Krala. Okay. Thank you. Hand it over to Anna.
Thank you, Zoran, for the introduction. So after this super interesting presentation that Tamara gave us, I will also go into the issue of identity building processes in the film, but I will just, the topic of this film will go a little bit in the past, into the World War II. And sorry, I will just share screen. Okay, so in the last 6 years, there has been a significant rise in the film production on Jasenovac's camp and related Ustaša crimes, taking their share in the mnemonic politics. So just for those who are not familiar with the context, I will just give a very brief a historical intro. So these films deal with the difficult topic of the Holocaust and genocide in the independent state of Croatia during the Second World War. Led by the Nazi-aligned Ustaša regime, it was a state that introduced racial laws and persecuted national minorities, Serbs, Roma, Jews, and also all those who opposed the regime. It established a network of concentration, labor, and death camps where prisoners were killed or exhausted to death by harsh living conditions and forced labor. The most notorious among them was Jasenovac, a system of camps known for its brutality, where men, women, and children were killed using knives, wooden mallets, or axes, or died of thirst and starvation. And the memory of this difficult past has been contested and taken part in numerous mnemonic battles in the public discourse, increasingly so from the mid-80s on. These mnemonic battles have been closely linked to the identity building processes, to the issues, who were the perpetrators, who were victims, negotiations on how to represent them, etc. What is interesting here to me is that it seems that in the last few years, it seems that actually a film has become one of leading media of that memory. These mutually diverse films that were produced in Croatia and in Serbia cover various cinematic and narrative approaches from ideologically completely opposing positions. They span from classical documentary, conspiracy theory, documentary negating Holocaust and genocide, or interview-oriented approach inspired by Lazar's Shoah, to docufiction and fictionalized historical drama. The reception of those films has been quite diverse, often related to the previous mnemonic battles. Still, it also revealed some new approaches to reshaping cultural memory and related group identities. So here in my talk, I will focus on two most recent and most popular, we can say, films. The Diary of Diana B, a docufiction film in Croatia in 2019, and the feature film Dara of Jasenovac, a Serbia's candidate for an Oscar in 2020. So my focus here will be on tracing changes and reconstellations of group identities and how films make visible broader shifts in collective memory, and do they kind of really trace those shifts or not. But okay, I will leave that for later. So the first example is the Diary of Diana B. The film's central character is Diana Budisavljević, a historical figure that initiated and led a civic action for rescuing Serbian children from the persecution and the camps set by the Ustaša regime, from Jasenovac's camp, but also other children camps. It is made as a docufiction, which means that it combined archive footage with testimonies of survivors and also a fiction part that is played by actors. It is, the main story is based on Diana's diary, but it is also complemented by historical research. Although this story about Diana and her rescue story of children was known during the Yugoslav times, her role was completely minimized. Her bourgeois background didn't quite fit into the dominant narrative on socialist revolution. And this is why the Communist Party and the Women's Anti-Fascist Front and activists of the National Liberation Movement appropriated all her merits for saving children. Her diary about the action that she led, was published in 2003, but only in the last 10 years did the story about Diana slowly started emerging in the public discourse, and this film really brought this story to the widest public, let's say. When it comes to identity building in the film, which is very interesting for me in this film, is that nationality, ethnic background, or religious denomination are not at all an identity building factor in the film, unlike many other films that deal with Jasenovac or Ustaša crimes, Holocaust, or genocide. So in that sense, this is novelty in this film in the context of the post-Yugoslav cinema on the topic. The central subject position here is constructed from the perspective of class. It represents middle-class citizens and their non-violent resistance to the regime, shared by Diana and her collaborators. Also, we have temporalities have quite an important role in the construction of subject position in the film, and also in representation of group identities. Sorry, just a moment. So through the film, we have jumps between past and present that complement Diana's narrative perspective with perspectives of so-called Diana's children that she saved, who share their memories. So here we have one of her witnesses, survived children. His name is Živko, and focalization of Živko and that of Diana reinforce one another. He shares his feeling of identity loss and his disappointment with not being able to trace his origin, despite keeping his number tag that was part of Diana's record about each child. After that, in a jump to the past, we see how the new Yugoslav government official forcibly confiscates Diana's card files and list of children names. And film's ending suggests the neglectful loss of Diana's lists of names in the new socialist state, which led to the impossibility of reconnecting children with their parents after the war. So in this film, we have this construction of meaning that is produced backwards from the perspective of post-socialist disillusionment. And also we have this usage of temporal parallelism. So there is a documentary footage inserted at the beginning of the film of the German army entering Zagreb in front of the cheering crowd. And also this footage is confronted towards the end of the film with matching footage of the National Liberation Army entering Zagreb, also with ovation from the public. So such visual and temporal parallelism suggests equalization between the two regimes. And it reveals double totalitarianism approach that is implicitly present through the film. Furthermore, the film reduces collective dimension of Diana's action to her individual efforts. It does not mention any other individual who took part in the action. Okay, it does mention some of the individuals, but it omits many others. So just to very, very briefly conclude here, we can say that just as a socialist memory omitted Diana's role in saving children to reinforce communist values based on collective partisan resistance and class struggle, the contemporary cultural memory as it is performed in this film does precisely the opposite. It omits the role of the communist activists, especially female anti-fascists who were part of Diana's team, in opposing the Ustaša regime and saving children to distance itself from the socialist and communist legacy. Okay, so this was a super brief sketch of the film analysis, but not to be too long, I will now jump to another example, Dara of Jasenovac. This is completely, let's say, different approach to the identity building process in the film. So this is a historical drama that follows the story of the Jasenovac camp through the eyes of a girl named Dara. The main narrative plot is fictionalized, but with references to historical events and with lots of elements incorporated from numerous survivors' testimonies. And also it restages certain events for which documentary footage exists. For example, Diana Budisavljević and Red Cross saving children from the camp, because in the film, about Diana, we could see the real archive footage of Diana and Red Cross entering Jasenovac and saving children. But also this film also that restages some of the scenes from Ustasha propaganda footage and photographs, etc. When it comes to identity building, it is, well, Dara and her father are focalizing the central subject positions of the narrated story. And unlike in the diary of Diana B, that builds its subject position around the class, the main identity building category here is ethnicity. Although we do see few Jewish and Roma prisoners in the camp, emphasis is on the Serbian victims and their suffering to a large extent. Same as in the case of the film about Diana, the role of communists is wholly omitted. There is no mentioning of communists or other political prisoners, which reduces the persecuted by the Ustasha only on their ethnicity without mentioning ideological opponents. The other identity building category in the film, although a more subtle one, is religion. In the opening scene, Dara's bigger brother explains to her that the only difference between them and Croats is religion. And later in the film, a small wooden Greek cross, a personal belonging of a killed inmate, provokes the rage of the Ustasha guard. On a metaphorical level, the cross saved the life of Dara's father, who decided to keep and hide it. And at the film's ending, we can see him catching his breath after he managed to escape the guards, lifting the cross towards the sky while he looks at it significantly. So there is a clear visual and semantic contrast between different types of crosses through the film. On the one set, and it's interesting how Tamara also mentioned this symbolic of the cross in Croatian films. So we can see some parallels here. So on the one side, there is the Greek cross related to Serbian victims. On the other side is the Latin cross, visually connected to the Ustasha perpetrators. The head nun, who treats the children in the camp cruelly and coldly, wears a rosary with a Latin cross in a visible place over her habit. And in an improvised classroom where the nun teaches Serbian children to become Ustasha youth and cross themselves as Roman Catholics, there is a photograph of the Archbishop of Zagreb, Lozica, wearing a huge Latin cross. It is placed next to the photo of Ante Pavelić and the crucifix. Moreover, a Ustasha guard and a priest known for his brutality as Peter Satan plays with the Latin cross in his hand during the speech of the camp's commander, Max Luborić. So apart from this mnemonic battle of crosses, the role of the Catholic Church in the camp leadership is overemphasized from the historiographical point of view. Although there were indeed priests among Ustasha and Jasenovac, some of whom did take part in the killings, there were also Catholic priests among prisoners killed in Jasenovac. Furthermore, the film portrays nuns in a bad light as having a significant organizational role there, even though there were no nuns in Jasenovac camp. They worked in other children camps, such as Jasenovac or Sisak. So even though this relationship between the Ustasha regime and the Croatian Catholic Church from the historiographical point of view is quite complex and highly contested, the film visually accentuates this relationship. It reduces it to the binary opposition between Orthodox and Roman Catholic Church and Serbian victims and Ustasha perpetrators. And of course, this was a super shortened version of analysis, but just to come to a brief conclusion, what I would also like to emphasize and also kind of build on what Tamara also said about actually films as memory productive films or memory offerings. So it's quite interesting that to see and quite important to see what was the reception of this film, because of course this analysis just showed identity building processes that are kind of proposed in those films. But of course, it's important for understanding how the group identities are portrayed in this film, in these films, how they sit within broader memory culture and public discourse. So the film Diary of Diana B was generally very well accepted, apart from a few dissonant voices. But it was broadcast on Croatian national television, on Serbian national television. It really got very, very positive reviews, also numerous awards. It was also well received internationally. got numerous awards on international festivals. So we can say that in that sense, this kind of identity representation did kind of resonated with maybe more general attitudes, or at least memory discourse. When it comes to the Dara of Jasenovac, it's much more, the reception was much more contested, and it really sparked lots of fierce polemics, and the reception was very divided. So it got quite harsh reviews abroad. Internationally, also in Croatia, there were few positive reviews, but generally reviews were super negative, often politicized, and in Serbia the reception was very divided, from very positive reviews to very negative feedback, and very divided reception. So maybe well, we can leave this maybe also for discussion, but I would also like to hear to draw upon Tamara's presentation, which was very interesting for me, also how she analyzed films that are quite new, and yet noticed that they're kind of, they fit into this 1990s scheme of representation. And here we could say also that this film, Dara of Jasenovac, really is quite close to the identity representation on a film of the 1990s when it comes to Jasenovac and Ustaša crimes. So here it is of course much milder version, but when we see this ethnic and religious identity building as a main driving force, it is something that kind of turns us back to the 1990s. But also it's interesting to see how this type of approach really, and also it is something that that also builds onto the ongoing memory wars between Croatia and Serbia when it comes to Jasenovac camp, when it comes to exhibition on Jasenovac camp. So it is of course part of much broader memory landscape. Also, what also interests me here is how this film that was super Diary of Diana B, that was really super successful in the sense of reviews and feedback, kind of did something new and offered new identity politics, let's say, in the film. So I was kind of wondering a lot, is it maybe a sign of a new memory path when it comes to the remembering World War II, or is it just, one film? But yeah, this is maybe something that can be left for discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Give a round of applause. As I said before, we'll save questions to the end, but there's no reason can't get them started typing. But let me go ahead and introduce Rebecca. Rebecca Carr explores the dynamic between popular culture and cultural identity. In 2021, she completed her PhD. Oh, recent PhD. There we go. Trinity College, Dublin, in cultural trauma and identity. In the genre she terms, quote, aftermath cinema. Carr holds 2 BAs, one in psychology and one in film, literature and drama, as well as a master's of philosophy in textual and visual studies. She is currently a teaching fellow in European studies at Trinity College, Dublin. I'm turning it over to Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Zoran. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's hope it works. All right. Oh no, spoilers. All right, let me back out of this for 1 sec. Apologies. Let me try and pull up I will start anew. Okie dokie. Nope, why would it? All right, progress. All right, so a big thank you to Zoran and Ervin for giving myself and Tamara and Anna a platform to share our research. As Zoran already mentioned, I will be speaking about the typology of cultural trauma in aftermath cinema. So my roadmap for this is really where I want to go with this is to say that when we're coming to terms with an experience that negatively affects a population, cinema can be a meaningful way, though complex, to understand what just happened. And we've seen that through the films that Anna and Tamara have presented. Because these films force directors and audiences alike to consider the beliefs that lead to the ordeal, the event, the period itself, and the aftermath is a significant part of ordering what may feel like chaos and integrating it into the collective memory. So in What is Aftermath Cinema and Cultural Trauma, I will define these terms and explain how cinematic narratives can declare or deny the injury necessary to proclaim the disruptive event or period as a cultural trauma. And I'll get a little bit into what that means because it's more of a process than a stamp. With mythology and trauma, I'll explain how I'm operationalizing mythology and as how I consider it kind of like a front line of identity. And with the typology, I hope to give you a visual rendering of where the films I surveyed landed after being analyzed for their tropes, symbols, stereotypes on, and reflections on war, homeland, and masculinity. And so I selected Greece and Serbia for this exercise because while they produce distinctive and rich works of cinema after their ordeals that demonstrate this reckoning with their mythology while looking in the mirror rather than necessarily confronting a foreign power. Additionally, this research is of particular interest because it was, obviously impacted by World War II, and it's within the sphere of Europe, but it's frequently overshadowed by bigger players such as Germany on the world stage, or in this case, in international movie theaters. As Tamara pointed out, such films from this region typically don't have the same budget or distribution and reach. So these two countries share some similarities, but really differ in their political ideologies and aims. Greece being at the era in question officially staunchly anti-communist, while Serbia, when it was part of Yugoslavia, was a haven for many Greek communist exiles. And so these differences are both a result of, and sorry, let me just grab my charger. Computer really knows how to pick its moments. That's cool. This is really a result of, and also led to, very distinct mythologies. And now in the West, there's been a shift towards the contemplation or the willingness to hear trauma narratives and a willingness to engage with them that was not as prevalent prior to the Holocaust. So with that trend of films exploring what happened, it really started to gain traction in the late 60s and early 70s with what happened in the Holocaust, not coincidentally, because rising generations were starting to ask who they were being asked to fight for and fight against. And so by plotting these two countries' contributions on the aftermath typology, we're able to see that with that timeline, because we'll be speaking about, and by with the timeline, Greece, looking at the period of the 1980s, takes a much delayed stance and really avails of that 10-year period of latency, whereas Serbia was much faster to put out films engaging with the process. And though I still maintain my decade-long period of reflection before I'll consider a film for this category, I will get into that. But it's indicating that this latency period that Holocaust memory studies underwent has really drastically shrunk, but not disappeared entirely. And I really look forward to expanding this survey to include productions not just from within these two countries, but from other countries, to really make salient the trajectory towards this diminishment of latency period. But most importantly, the trend towards a polyphony of voices achieving social signification is not to be underestimated or undervalued. So I will, okay, let me progress. And then, of course, with exploring aftermath cinema, typology beyond the Balkans, yeah, just which countries I would like to look at next. So what do I mean by aftermath cinema, and what does it spell for cultural trauma? So the way I define aftermath cinema is it's the films that explore the legacy of large-scale disruptive event or period that changed the life for society as a group. The way that this is possible, aftermath cinema emerges from aftermath society. And I treat films as cultural artifacts and the product of their society. So by default, these films are in dialogue with the environment in which they're produced. And to get specific about aftermath cinema, I use it I try to look at films that come 10 years after the shooting has stopped, or there's some return to the second, they've moved up a little bit from the bottom rung of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So in the 10 years since the end of Yugoslav wars or the fall of the junta in Greece, Serbian and Greek societies have had time to move from crisis towards stability. And so after a decade, there's been time for reflection, not just reaction. And so the films that I analyzed portray and engage with the aftermath society in which they were released. And they're not the widely acclaimed films like Pretty Village, Pretty Flame by Dragojevic in '96 or Z by Costa Gravas in 1969, because they really focus on, battlegrounds or assassinations, and they're, I say reactive, but I don't mean that in a negative sense, but I am looking for a more meditative spot, I guess. So instead, these films gauge the impact that these disruptive events have had on civilian life, national identity away from the front line, and after soldiers have returned home, as the case may be. Ultimately, I'm trying to draw attention to the role of films in the process of social signification that distinguishes cultural trauma from cultural collective injury. So what do I mean by that? Well, in situations where it's possible not to reinvent the wheel, I opt for that. I subscribe to Ron Ehrman's explanation that cultural trauma is a dramatic loss of identity and meaning, a tear in the social fabric affecting a group of people that has achieved some degree of cohesion. And so here we consider how these particular films are drawing attention or not to a collective injury that contribute or that culminate in the announcement of an event or a period as cultural trauma. This is very much a social constructivist perspective, and in no way, shape, or form diminishes, individual or, collective trauma. But this term cultural trauma is socially constructed and very specific as the outcome of the process of social signification. Collective injury may absolutely be considered a negative impact experienced by many individuals within a group, either directly or indirectly. And psychological trauma impacts an individual's identity. Collective injury affects the group. And then cultural trauma is the label that acknowledges the widespread recognition of this. So Nicholas Demirtzis, who frequently collaborates with Ervin, notes that a civil war does not in itself constitute a cultural trauma. To become one, such an event must undergo a process of social signification. Namely, it has to be signified and become socially accepted and constructed as a trauma. So in other words, an adverse event may occur, but it only becomes a cultural trauma in retrospect once it has been articulated as an ordeal more significant than an individual or collective injury. And so films that I determine are a part of aftermath cinema help catalyze that process of signification. So in trying to define mythology, I simply for the sake of how it gets operationalized on the typology slide, I say mythology is a large part of a culture, but it also exists in a symbiotic relationship with it. So it comprises collective memory, demonstrates the rationale for socially acceptable behaviors and adverse outcomes of deviance, and it encourages adherence to norms and the inclusion of individual members. So it could be ancient Greek mythology, but it could also be who's allowed at the coffee house from which time to which time. So I'm deploying it very, very broadly here. So with that, with the films that I watched, an inverse correlation arises between mythology and trauma when confronting the ordeals. The smaller the presence of mythology, the more pronounced the impact of trauma. So in other words, the more a film draws from past endured suffering, real, fictional, not relevant, the less traumatic more recent events appear. And I'm saying this based on these films, but obviously I now need to circle back with my fellow presenters so we can plot their films here. But so conversely, the more a narrative eschews the past, the more traumatic the more recent event is perceived. So the two films from Serbia, On the Milky Road and whatever your feelings about Kusturica, I know I have a lot. Again, I treat all films equally in terms of they're all in the cultural artifact basket. So Kusturica's film On the Milky Road and a Serbian film by Spasojevic reside in very, very opposite ends of the spectrum here. This is because Kusturica relies on mythology to really diminish the trauma of the Yugoslav wars. By contrast, what little mythology appears in Spasojevic's film is really treated as inauthentic and rotten and the cause of the trauma. And so this confirms the interpretations of events are multifold and should be expected even among members of the same community. And so then with 1980s Greek aftermath cinema, it engaged more thematically in nuanced international dialogue than I found with 2010's Serbia. And one facilitating device of this was that many of the films produced in that era depicted authority as absent or untouchable. And this is very consonant with the Greek experience. But I also feel like this feeds into how characters are portrayed, especially in Voyage to Kythera and the Stone Years. It stayed on a much more personal level than the Serbian films. And this empathy-based approach led to more mild-mannered portrayals than the very symbolic worlds portrayed in Serbian film and On the Milky Road. So I really concentrate on the mechanics of how cultural mythology is deployed in these films rather than on the country's political history. But we need a little bit of background, and I'll provide that as I speak about each nation. But I don't, unlike the fabulous presentations of my two colleagues here, I don't get into the analysis of the film too much because I don't do spoilers. No, I'm kidding. I do, and I love them. All right, but just quickly, so Milky Road is fascist in that it celebrates existing mythology and this kind of exceptionalist perspective. And it says Yugoslav wars were not traumatic because simply being a Serb is traumatic, according to the film. And so the faith in mythology protects against trauma. With Voyage to Kythera, it's more eclectic. It observes mythology as it evolves, and it says that trauma is caused by both recalling and rejecting memories, and it's Brechtian, distanced. It documents the experience. Stone Years really challenges official and anthropological norms, really challenges mythology to force a better society. And it says, or it treats it like trauma is caused by oppression, but we're working through it. And basically, discomfort equals growth. A Serbian film dismantles myth, dismantles hope, rejects existing mythology totally and utterly. And it registers trauma as being caused by belief in this misguided, exploited, exceptionalist mythology, and they're now left with nothing. And punchline, well, not that there's a punchline, the take-home message, if you will, is that major trauma has occurred without any mythology to guide Serbian society, because that's what got them into the mess in the first place. All right, so just a bit of background about the two Greek films. During World War II, the British Army fought alongside the Greek, primarily communist partisans to drive out the Nazis. Then, as the war drew to a close, the British government concluded that it's economically undesirable for Greece to be aligned with communists and the Soviet Union. So the Greek National non-communist army, supported by the British military and paramilitary units, drove the anti-fascists, aka communists, into prison, hiding, or exile. And the Greek national government obstructed both adamant and even accused communists from participating in society. And so we have a group of people indigenous to Greece who were extirpated from their homeland. Additionally, Greek society was undergoing a highly charged transition period caused by internal migration, both enforced and voluntary, the Marshall Plan, and British and later American oversight. So this period of tremendous flux led to widespread poverty and uncertainty. So 1967, several colonels staged a coup, which they claim was a temporary measure to return Greece to its path to greatness, make Greece great again. So this junta ended up lasting 7 years. And during this time, they really tried to rebrand Greece's official message as a single, unified, and unilateral place by trawling history for symbols and rhetoric to define Greek identity. However, this is not actually reflective of Greek history, which is in fact very rich, heterogeneous, spanning from ancient Greece through Byzantium to modern Greece. And so by government policy removing implementation or removing communists from sight who fought the Nazis for them to be able to explore what it means to be Greek, that's messy. So Voyage to Kythera and Stone Years portray the nation in this aftermath of the Civil War and the junta, and they tell the accounts of the Greeks who were rejected by their homeland, what the war meant to them, and what this did for Greek masculinity, which was diminished, but in other respects, especially in the case of the Stone Years, really elevated Greece's shot at emerging feminism. And so in Voyage to Kythera, Spiros, the guy we see kind of emerging from the fog, that is intentional, he's a Civil War communist who's been living in exile in Ukraine for 32 years, receives permission to return to Greece. And his mere existence is a reminder to his family and the government of all this unaddressed, painful history. And so once he's home, he battles with his daughter, who's now this liberated woman, and his neighbors who want to sell their land to create a ski resort. And these are the same neighbors who always pursued, the more lucrative rather than the more principal option, especially during the war. And so Spiros's decline from this once viral rebel fighter to this man barred from the local coffee shop until, spoiler alert, until the government sweeps him out to sea, like Gregor Samsa from Metamorphosis. Angelopoulos treats the film very literally and figuratively like a stage, and he keeps pulling in characters from different periods, ancient Greece or from the Asia Minor Exodus, trying to engage the viewer with the realities of Greek heritage. So with the Stone Years, it's a much more exclamatory narrative that takes a much more unwavering stance on the impact of the government's effort to rid Greece of communists. It's based on a true story, and the woman that we see in the poster there exhibits great agency, unlike what we were led to believe about women at the time. And she plays a leading role in the undergraduate communist network. She really seizes back the microphone about communists at her trial. And then while incarcerated, she forms a sisterhood because she's in a female's prison where there are no men around. She creates a somewhat vibrant existence. And so when they're finally released from prison, she and her husband in 1974, there's now this option to live in so-called domestic bliss, but this results in a real great loss of power for her. So she's like, well, is this what I want from my homeland? I don't know. So yeah, there's a lot there. Okay, so with Serbia, I will skip over a lot of this because I think people are acquainted largely with what I have to say, just giving a bit of background. But I'll say by 2001, due in part to American and English media coverage and Serbia's own Eurosceptic foreign policy, it was and continues to be treated with caution by much of the international community. And so the two Serbian films hold outlier places on the typology. And again, this is because Kusturica celebrates Serbian mythology uncritically and utilizes its symbols as evidence that explain, recur, and resonate with this perspective of the Yugoslav wars. Conversely, Spasojevic holds the same mythology responsible and blames, this mythology encouraged by the Balkan male for this traumatic subjugation. Excuse me, not COVID. for the subjugation of Serbian people. And so rather than seeing mythology as a means of sustaining national identity, Spasojevic treats mythology as the acts perpetrators wielded not just against other groups, but as their own, as well as their own people. Mythology doesn't heal or reassure, it hurts and it undermines, prompting the protagonist to remove himself and his family from its grasp. Minor spoiler alert. How am I doing on time?
I sent you a message about that.
Oh, I didn't. Sorry. Okay. 3 minutes. Okay, great.
That was a few minutes ago.
Oh, okay. Well, I think with that, we'll just skip along ahead to what can we do with this? You know, how do we take this beyond the Balkans? Or applying aftermath cinema typology beyond the Balkans, also known as AAC-TBB. Catchy. It's this is consistent with the postmodern trajectory towards fragmentation, which some find to be a disruptive experience with lasting consequences in its own right. Each of the films here offer a singular perspective, leading to a greater appreciation of collective responses that emerge once the conflict ends. And so I think it would be valuable to continue analyzing films according to this typology, but also starting to venture out into the concept of French resistance in the this resistancialisme, or the Franco-Algerian Wars. Closer to home, we could test this theory with post 9/11 attitudes in the US, or more presently, I think it would be a valuable exercise to look at Ukrainian and Russian films leading up to the events of 2014. I hope that by highlighting mythology in movies, cinema will be more recognized as a means of exploring aftermath, because as Nietzsche points out, myth is a metaphor for the inexpressible. Thank you.
Let's all give a round of applause to Rebecca. We have a few minutes for questions. We'll give you a second to, if you want to type a question, or if you want to just go ahead and virtually raise your hand and speak your question. Oh, we got one. Chloe, yes.
Hi, this is actually for Rebecca, and because I was just very interested in what you were saying there about the end of like, how do we apply this? I was wondering, is there sort of like, could there be events around this? Like, can you kind of pull like hard data from if there was film screenings? Have people, you know, reacted to this in that kind of way? Have there been organizings of film screenings along those lines? Because I think it'd be really interesting to know what kind of feedback you just get from people who go into a screening. So I don't know if that's something that's part of your work. Thanks.
This, I have been avoiding it like the plague, because no one, to my knowledge, has successfully come up with a definitive method of measuring, well, first of all, sorry, thank you for your question. No one has come up with a definitive way of capturing audience perceptions other than a more intrusive method that is, you know, asking them. And that's the thing about audience viewership, is that it can be a very personal and non-confrontational experience, and very, very subjective. I mean, you get the same people sitting in the same movie from all from the same town, and they're all going to walk away with different perceptions. And you know, people like Maurice Halbwach will speak to this, in that each home functions as its own little microculture. So can we say, you know, definitively that one film operates this way or that way. We can't. That's why I stuck with focusing on the tropes and existing printed material. But what we could do is take a slightly larger scale thing, for example, with post 9/11 attitudes, and look at what were the headlines and what were the op-eds, and how did this, what was the dynamic like with, movies that came out afterwards, and do kind of a comparative thing like that. I hope that answers your question. It is a legitimate one, but it is very much an elusive unicorn.
But I think that's just to add on to that, to say that's probably the strength of it, is that it can be so subjective that it allows for that. That's probably the strength of it, actually. And so thank you very much.
Thank you. And Karen's chiming in here. It would still be intrusive, but if people are willing, it seems like a good phenomenological approach that might still yield a lot of interesting data. I agree with that. Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions? I have a million questions, but I want to open it up to everyone. If you want to type them out or just raise your hand virtually, that would be nice. Oh, we got Sven, go ahead.
Hi. Three great presentations. Most of your work I know very well, but I have a question for Tamara, actually. So I've watched The General. I haven't watched number 55. And I had this feeling of this self-explanatory part that you say. And this is especially about when the Gotovina and some other persons, but especially Gotovina, talks with POWs, with prisoners of wars, imprisoned Serbs. And there he always says, like, we have to respect your rights, la, la, la. And this doesn't even sound like a real dialogue. It sounds completely as if, I was thinking that as if he was giving a testimony before court. And he's saying that in a dialogue with that person, like almost speaking to them as in a third person, not in a second person. And my question is, therefore, are these parts done because even the authors, the script writers, actually, the film is made mostly by a book of Nenad Ivankovic, but like, I think some of the parts are kind of like they stray away from the book. And are these parts done in this way because even the authors don't believe these truths themselves? Like as if you're trying to explain something to yourself that you don't even believe. And you're overcompensating in that sense. And tied to that question, when you were saying if movies are memory objects or are like, carrying some collective memory. I'm paraphrasing now a little bit. But in this sense, is this movie, especially General, really not only a memory object, but it really is a part of this kind of collective memory, especially in Croatia, which kind of repeats the truths. Some of them, those groups that kind of propose those truths don't believe them. At least that's my opinion. Thank you.
I love this question. There's no right answer to this question. So I have to be honest, as much as I love this question, there's no good answer to it because I cannot know what the director intended. The only thing that I can tell you is how I think what he possibly intended should be interpreted, and what I think this film does. So Rebecca mentioned at one point that we should study these films as dialogue, and I actually agree. I didn't have a chance, although I spoke way longer than I should have, I didn't have a chance to explain how I actually observe films. And I think, so I borrow from James Verge, who reads Mikhail Bakhtin, and Bakhtin has this idea of dialogicality, and he talks about hidden dialogicality, how we are constantly in dialogues with previous utterances. And I think the whole dialogue of memory, including cinema in Croatia, is a dialogue of hidden dialogicality. And this is not, I wish it was a particularly innovative assumption, but it actually isn't. Tamara Banjeglav speaks about this when she says in one of her articles that every single narrative about the Homeland War is in discussion with the dominant political narrative of the Homeland War in Croatia. So I think when my interpretation of what is going on in The General, the standard interpretation is that these people are simply bad at script writing and that this is a bad film because it's poorly written. But I think that's wrong, to an extent at least. I think what is happening is that the film tries to create an image, and this is why I speak of it of Gotovina as a victim of the International Criminal Court. The film consistently tries to portray Gotovina as this heroic, self-restrained character, because it wants to say, without ever saying it, it is impossible that he has committed or not known about the crimes that were taking place, which is what he was tried for, found guilty, and then later acquitted in front of the ICTY. So he is continuously portrayed as this moral vertical, as we would say in Croatian. And part of being the moral vertical is having to say all these things that don't sound like a conversation at all. I absolutely agree. Nobody says in a situation, we need to respect war. We need to respect our prisoners of war. Nobody would say this. But if you want to speak about an event that you can't speak of, and that is a trial, why is he on trial? Which is the central part of his story, which is never mentioned in film. You just see it at the beginning and then you see it at the end. And he says, I'm guilty, and you are meant to believe that he feels guilty because of all the lives that he sacrificed, but not about for anything that he's being put on trial on. You have to somehow enter into dialogue with all the implications of the verdict without mentioning the verdict or the indictment in itself. And this is how the film does it, I think. And so it is partially, for those of you who are familiar with the work of Anton Vrdoljak, he's pretty didactic as a director. This is not the first time that he does this. All of his films have this, which is part of his style, also perhaps part of his talent as a filmmaker. But it has a very clear purpose, I think, in this film. I don't know if that answers the question.
So we're scheduled to end at 1:30, but we're going to stick around for a few more minutes because we've got some good conversation, good questions. For those of you who have to leave, remember, we'll be up on YouTube, so you can catch some of that later. But Anna, there is a question from Zdenko in the forum there.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Zdenko, for your question. Regarding these films and impact, well, I think that the film about Diana Budisavljević actually had quite important impact in the way that not maybe Jasenovac, but Ustaša crimes also connected to Jasenovac were perceived. In the sense that in that film, we really see for the first time some of the archival footages that were taken directly from the camp, also from Jasenovac, but also children camps. And these footages are really moving. That you can see dying, starving children, and they're really terrible. And in that sense, I think they and also especially they're important for I think for Croatian public, because in Croatia we do have a high quite rise, unfortunately, of negation of these crimes, especially in film and in the public discourse. So in that sense, it did change, I think, perception. And also the film kind of the Ministry of Education kind of allowed this film to be screened during history classes in schools. So I think in that sense it really had impact. But when it comes to the Dara of Jasenovac that you asked, I don't know if my impression is that it didn't change much about how it is talked about Jasenovac. And of course, this story about Jasenovac in World War II is always connected to the war of the 1990s. It's kind of, it's merged completely. And this is why it's kind of all these identity battles that are going through Jasenovac are also kind of they're trying to reclaim the war of the 1990s. And so, but I'm afraid that when all this kind of discussion that were very present in the public sphere in Serbia and in Croatia were were more or less kind of repeating previous discussions, because Jasenovac was really present in the public sphere and before, when it comes to the memorial museum in Jasenovac, or when Serbia had exhibition about Jasenovac in New York. So it's always some sort of public dispute, and often it's just kind of, you know, repeating the same phrases. So I don't have an impression that it really made any significant change.
Could I just follow up? Sorry, I wrote my text. I didn't know if we were going to run out of time, so I just wanted to get the question in. But for the follow-up, I just wanted to, it's less of a question than just a comment. What I was really interested by last year during the commemoration of the Operation Oluja in Serbia, right? They had the actress from Dara, from Jasenovac, participate in this kind of staged, I don't know even how to describe it, right? But the actress in her character from the film was kind of part of this commemoration of Oluja in Serbia. So it's like, it's almost as if the film is being instrumentalized to really kind of stitch together these disparate memories to create a kind of a new nationalist narrative, at least in Serbia. So I don't know if you have any comments on this, but I just find it really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. That's super interesting what you said. And yes, I forgot to mention the director and screenwriter of Dara Jasenovac, they announced that they will make a series, that they will turn Dara Jasenovac in the kind of TV series, and it will end with Oluja. So they will kind of, you know, stretch it to the 1990s war, and wow. And Oluja will be grand finale. And also this screenwriter, she actually she lived in Croatia, and she was one of the victims of Oluja. So she ran with her family. So she took this, she in most of her interviews, she really kind of accentuates that. And she also said that the kind of grand finale of the story of Jasenovac is Oluja. So it's really, as you already noticed, it's super closely linked.
Thank you.
May I just jump in with a comment there, because what Zdenko said is very true of how the film is now serving as, there's this book, Prosthetic Memory by Alison Landsberg. I don't know if you're familiar, but she's saying films function as like an artificial memory for people who maybe weren't direct witnesses or, you know, otherwise engaged in, you know, the conversation or the material, but films then function like an artificial memory that people can then empathize with. And this can be deployed to, you know, learn about the Holocaust or Jasenovac or slavery in the US, for example, but it can be a double-edged sword. Great question, by the way.
I have a question, unless anyone else has to jump in, and this is maybe for everyone, and maybe coming off a little bit what was just said here. I'm interested in the relation between genre and sort of historical mediation and or trauma. Thinking here, you know, particularly the war film genre. Do we want to call the Holocaust film a genre, right? I mean, there's a question there. But then, of course, some of the art films, Rebecca, you mentioned. I mean, you know, like on one spectrum, you have Engopoulos mediating everything. I mean, that's also like a film within a film. But then on the other hand, we have this sort of like, oh, we're going to directly recreate history, right? But so I guess what I'm thinking about is, and this is kind of thinking about how Daria was employed for propaganda purposes, is what do you see as, in the films and you're looking at, and the projects you're working at, what do you see as the role of genre in mediating how audiences are processing their relationship to the past? Or are all these films really just about the present, right? Because what we see, currently in Bosnia and other places is, once again, a resurgence of some of the more despicable kind of right-wing nationalist forces. So I'm curious if any comments about how genre plays a part in this, and what does that mean in terms of historical mediation?
Zoran, can I start? Because I'm very keen on also answering Zdenko's question as a follow-up, but also because I think out of the two films that I analyzed, one of them is a perfect example for this question, and that is Number 55. So I already mentioned Number 55 is an action film, and it is an action film that is modeled on Attack on Precinct 13. And Attack on Precinct 13 is a film that doesn't give its villain any kind of identity. So we know that it's a gang of some sort that's attacking out of everywhere, and they just keep coming out like zombies. And when the Number 55 came out, there was a great discussion about how wonderful it is that we finally have an action film about the Homeland War, because there's only one or two action films that came out about the Homeland War. They're both amateur films, and they were actually seen, why they're also interesting to me, by Pavic, which is a corrective to his film, cinema of self-victimization. So two films made by amateur veterans in which they show themselves killing the Serbs were the two action films about the Homeland War. But what nobody really paid attention to, I think, which is really, really key in this case, is that this is a film that is based on a true story. So it thematizes the Croatian side as a side of real suffering, but it completely dehumanizes the enemy. I think worse than any other film that has done this, by turning the enemy into a zombie. And that zombie actually still has characteristics that are typical and usually laid out on these Serbian characters in contemporary Croatian cinema, which is this Chetnik heritage, which is this kind of always the same appearance, these tropes that have very little to do with reality of Croatian Serbs, for example, even those who participated in the uprising. So I think genre here serves as a deepening of the division between the Croatian and Serbian memory of the war, because it dehumanizes the enemy on an entirely new level. And I understand, what I want to say is that I think there's a big difference between the two films that I'm discussing. One of them is very, very non-interesting as a film. The General is a non-interesting filmic product. But Number 55 is a very interesting filmic product done by a very competent director. And I think it's therefore even worse for what it does to national memory, because it completely dehumanizes the enemy and turns the hero into an even bigger hero than it would have otherwise been. But I want to, if I can, just jump in and answer Zdenko's question about Goran Višnjić. And again, I think I cannot say what the intentions of the authors were. And I'm already kind of thinking, so Sven has this idea saying, well, it's just a family affair. Goran Višnjić is Anton Vrdoljak's, he's the husband of his daughters. They have this family connection. But I think this morning, I was reading a very interesting discussion about Yugoslav cinema, in which somebody said, what's really missing in post-Yugoslav cinema is that we no longer have these great stars playing historical figures in Yugoslav cinema. This is something that Yugoslav cinema is really missing. And then the response to that by a colleague of mine, a film critic, was, why would we want to colonize ourselves with these actors? Because in Yugoslavia, we saw, Tito was played by these great American actors, Australian actors. And there was this idea, they add something to the film, but the value of the film doesn't come from that. But in post-Yugoslav cinema, it is very frequent that key historical characters are played by foreign actors or actors that have foreign reputation. Think about Gospa, for example, in which Martin Sheen plays the key priest. And there's a reason for this. And I think the reason for this is that these films are also supposed to tell the truth of what was happening in Croatia and what was happening in the case of Gospa in Yugoslavia to a foreign audience. And selecting Goran Višnjić plays into the quote that I used earlier by Croatian president, which says, I hope that this film will travel and tell the truth of what can happen to foreign audiences as well. I think that's a big role that Goran Višnjić has, apart from obviously being a very popular figure in Croatia itself, and in a way aligned with the very popular figure of General Gotovina, who is perceived as very handsome, very charismatic, just as Goran Višnjić is. So in a way, he's a logical choice. But I'm not sure that I can answer the question of, what the intention is. But I think this is what it does in terms of the kind of impact that it produces, or at least that it is expected to produce.
Rebecca, did you have your hand up still, or are you? You're muted.
Two years and still don't have it down. I would like to respond to your question about genre, and I accept that it can be used as a grouping of mentions. For example, we know that this is a horror movie because of the lighting, the music, the number of corpses at the end of the film. And these kinds of conventions are currently really getting remixed in a parody and pastiche way in young cinema. So like the under 15 set. And I appreciate that they're, trying to make, both children and their parents happy, but it really is starting to collapse in on itself in a, convention defying way. And it's kind of aligning with the evolving syntax that's coming out of young people's usage of TikTok, for example, So that's one way of looking at genre. Another way of looking at it is, thematically, like you were saying, it could be Holocaust films, Vietnam War films, grouping it like that. To a degree, lest I be accused of being a gatekeeper, I would say it's just how you would organize your own collection on your shelves. But so I speak about it topically, but something that is very important to me is that the year in which it was made is significant, because we've seen, especially with this shift towards postmodernism, that there's a lot of remixing. Or, for example, when J.J. Abrams' reboot of Nazi vampires in occupied France came out, I think when that, I think that came out like 4 or 5 years ago. I can't even remember the name. It was something probably straightforward, like Nazi vampires. But the question then becomes, and, like with Dara Jasenovac and 55, who are they making this for? And I know that Chloe raised this question of how do we know what the audience is looking for? But I think there are undercurrents in society that allow us to recognize, the different facets of the conversation, or voices wishing to join the conversation. And so my question is always, who are they making this film for? Particularly with American and other for-profit and mainstream films, they need to know that they're going to get return on investment. So they need to know that, people are going to buy tickets or downloads and whatnot. So there has to be a hunger for this. And that question is, what I ask whenever I start a film.
Yeah, as far as I know, in the sort of Chicago area, Daria had did okay money with the sort of Serbian community. And I guess I won't share my opinion of the film, but I didn't go and see it on the screen. But it's just curious to me. I mean, I think it's a great answer, and we'll wrap up here. Again, maybe there's a style question. I watched recently a lot of Czech New Wave films about the Holocaust directly or tangentially, and Diamonds of the Night, The Cremator. I just wonder if, would films like that be open to being co-opted for a nationalist cause? I mean, whatever we think of Daria as an actual aesthetic object, right? What Zhenko talked about kind of makes me skeptical of the whole thing, right? But again, that's not the film's fault, right? But it strikes me as a kind of interesting conversation about all of this. let's kind of wrap up since we got over. Does anyone have a last minute question they want to ask? I know we had a great comment here from, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that. Sorry, I've been trying to read who wrote this here. Ivana, yes. Or if anyone else had a last minute question.
No, I would just like to say that it's a great comment and thanks, Ivana. Yeah, but definitely, you know, children are really kind of symbols of innocence, and it's really okay. And also it's interesting in all these interviews that director and screenwriter of Dara Jasenovac gave they always emphasized how they wanted to kind of represent Jasenovac through the eyes of an innocent girl. But it interestingly, really the whole kind of narration is really some sort of a compilation of different fragments from different testimonies, and these testimonies are from the survivors, so not children. So it was from other people, and that's also interesting because it's kind of, well, they really try to really fit all these existing actually narratives into something that should be innocent gaze, which maybe this is one of the reasons why the story didn't go so smoothly and the whole film looked awkward. But yes, that's really a great comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I didn't want to take anyone's time. I just thought it's, you know, because I study children and the way they're important for nation building and the national narrative. So I thought this was one really fascinating pattern that I see in both of the films that you talked about. And it's just very interesting how the commemoration of children as, you know, ethno-national symbols is, you know, getting all these multimedia forms in the last decade. So I just, you know, just a brief comment, but thank you so much for your presentation.
All right, we'll take one last question. Diana wrote something interesting here. Anna, if you wanted to comment on that.
Okay, should I read it or? So when you showed the two photos side by side, welcoming the occupiers, welcoming the liberators, I was struck by how the photo on the left was mainly men and one on the right mainly women. Does gender also figure in identity building in these films? That's really great question. Well, I think definitely gender does play a great part in the sense that we really have you know, main heroines that are female, and this is quite new for the film on that topic. We had also one film, Lea and Daria, that was filmed a few years ago, Holocaust story about a Jewish girl that was killed in Auschwitz from Zagreb. And we had two main female characters. But apart from that, before that, we didn't have this, you know, films dealing with World War II, with Memory on Jasenovac, Ustasha crimes that would have main female characters. So, so yes, I would say that in both films, having female roles is something quite new. But apart from that, also in the film about Diana, we can say how the whole story about Diana was, since it was not recognized until recently, and she was omitted from the history. So and now it's kind of again recognized. So it is in that sense, it really gender is super important here. And as I said, for Dara Jasenovac, those testimonies that were basis for the screenwriter, there were mainly from men, but also there were some females who did those testimonies, but this fictional character was mainly there as some sort of to collect them all. Yeah.
So let me just wrap up here, some comments. I linked again here to our website. I really appreciate these talks, and you know, if you want to thank anybody, you should thank Rebecca, Anna, and Tamara. I believe this began with Rebecca approaching us, Ervin and I, and so as I said at the beginning, consider this a kind of collective and open space for ideas, conversation, and virtual community. So if you do have anything you're interested in presenting, send us an email. I'm sure for fall, we'll be looking for some things. I really look forward to hearing from any of you with anything you have. We're very open, and again, it's not an ownership thing. You know, think of us more as the IT guys or something like that. This is all about you, right? But I want to take 1 second and make sure we give a round of applause to our speakers for really fascinating and I think important talks. I wish maybe they weren't so timely, but they are. So I want to thank everyone, and please do reach out if you have any ideas of your own. Nice seeing you all. You could welcome to log off too. Ervin and I and the panel will chat a little bit too. Or